Thank you very much for the privilege of being able to speak to all of you here in North Carolina. Let me begin first by very briefly explaining what my philosophy was when I was at the Department of Education and that I brought to Common Core's Validation Committee in order to become what I have become as the chief national critic of Common Core's English Language Arts standards. When I was in the Massachusetts Department of Education and found myself in charge of K-12 standards, teacher licensing regulations, and teacher licensure tests, the philosophy I brought was simply one that content mattered. We had to begin with what kind of content we wanted in some way to make sure that all students were exposed to and could master, if they could, by the time they completed public education, and to raising the floor. This is very important. The basic concern was not closing the gaps. That would come. But the basic concern was how do you raise the floor for all groups? And that is what the Massachusetts standards and all the other things associated with it, the tests, professional development, including teacher licensing regulations and so forth, it was all designed to raise the floor for all demographic groups. And it did that successfully. And it even accelerated the progress for those groups that had been the lowest groups. So that was what was serving as our vindication for focusing on raising the floor, not necessarily trying to close gaps, which was part of the problem I saw immediately with Common Core. Because once you start to look at closing gaps, you begin to lower the ceiling, since it's very difficult to understand what to do to raise the floor. And it becomes a defeating, self-defeating approach to K-12 curriculum and instruction and the whole intellectual development of your student body. What I'm going to do first here is briefly point out what I found as the flaws in Common Core's English Language Arts standards, because I've written about it so extensively, almost ad nauseum from some people's point of view, but I just want to briefly recap what I saw as the main focus. I focused mainly on English Language Arts because that's my area of expertise, reading and literary study. But I do know from working with Professor Milgram what the central issues in the math standards are as well, and I'll just touch briefly upon that. First of all, I looked at the nature of Common Core standards, both its college readiness and grade level reading standards, and they are for the most part content free. So that was my immediate clue, tip-off, that there's a problem. They are skills, not content oriented. Question is, what's wrong with skills? Well, skills can be applied to any level of education. And I'll be simplistic. Find the main idea is a skill. You can apply the main idea to the Three Little Pigs. You can find the main idea of Moby Dick. But the difference between the Three Little Pigs and Moby Dick is 12 grades worth. So skills don't get you very far. The content matters. And if the standards, for the most part, ignore real substantive content, then you've got a problem with your standards. They are not really standards. The second point that I finally discovered more recently when I was doing some work with Georgia's old standards, which were far better than Common Core's ELA standards, was that Common Core stresses writing more than reading. Now, it isn't because I come from the field of reading research that I'm privileging reading. It's just that we know from 100 years of research and from the research that has been done, looking at the relationship between writing and reading, we know that all good writers are good readers. Being a good reader doesn't make you a good writer. You have to do some writing, but writing depends upon reading. And if Common Core at every grade level has more writing standards than reading standards, we have a deep conceptual problem. And that is going to show up in the classrooms all around every state, where teachers will be spending an enormous time trying to get kids to do the kind of writing they can't really do because they haven't read and internalized the models that come from knowing what good English sentence structure looks like. It's extensive reading that helps you to understand what a good English sentence looks like with a subject, a verb, or whatever. So that's the second observation, that these standards have a profound flaw built into them. Teachers will spend too much time on something that isn't going to pay off. Third, to go along with the problem with too much time on writing and not enough on reading, they then have divided the reading standards so that over 50% from K to 12 is going to focus on something called informational text, and less than 50% will be on literary study. Now, there has been an attempt to justify that by saying, well, yes, in real life at the post-secondary level, you do much more informational reading than writing. But what you do in your adult life doesn't mean developmentally that that's what you do during K-12. And what we do know, and now I'm going to move into the fourth issue, is that how children learn to think critically comes from what English teachers generally do when they teach kids to read between the lines of complex literary texts. You do not learn to think analytically, and by critically, I mean analytically. You do not learn to read and write analytically unless you are looking at material that you need to learn how to read between the lines of. This is not going to happen with your math textbooks, your history textbooks, your science textbooks. They're designed to give information. And it's information that's presented. You have to think about this just from a common sense point of view. They're not trying to be ambiguous. They want to convey scientific or historical or mathematical information as directly, as unambiguously as possible. So this is not going to be the kind of material that will teach you how to read between the lines. They want you to read the lines and understand what's there. So it's that English teacher who may in grade 11 or 12 be teaching students how to understand, for example, Wordsworth's famous poem that begins with "My heart leaps up when I see a rainbow in the sky" and ends with one of those famous lines, "The child is father to the man." How do you understand such a cryptical line like that? That's where critical or analytical thinking takes place in the English class. And I can't speak too much to that, but any of you who have remembered what old Miss Gradgrind did in your English class will recall struggling with, what does Shakespeare's "to be or not to be" mean? How do you understand these? Struggling with it and learning how to think about its meaning is the development or continued development of analytical thinking. Now, the next point is that by decreasing literary study, which is what Common Core does and tries to justify, you are decreasing the opportunities for the development of critical thinking. So what you're having is a dumber curriculum, even if you're being presented with, well, this is what we do in real life as adults when we go to town meeting or meetings of the city council, and you're trying to understand whatever you're being presented with. If you haven't learned how to read between the lines, then you can't read the kind of material you need to read as good citizens. Finally, and this was an observation based on looking at what New York City children were doing with writing in the middle grades, they were trying to establish claims and then evidence. And I asked the teacher, because it was clear, teachers, more than one, why their children in grades 6, 7, and 8 were having such a terrible problem trying to establish a claim. They had been reading short stories. Now, how does a short story help you to establish a claim? It's not there to begin with. They didn't even know what a claim was. It could have been a baggage claim, as far as they understood it. They don't know what a claim is because they've never read anything that has a claim in it. If you haven't been able to teach the kind of material so that your reading standards are coordinated with what you're asking kids to do in writing, kids can't do it. They haven't internalized the structure of what you're asking them to write. This is why years ago, 9th grade, 10th grade teachers began teaching kids how to write essays, because they had been exposed over several years to what an essay looked like. It's very different from a piece of literature where you don't have a purpose declared in the opening paragraph. No short story writer starts out with, this is the purpose of my short story. So you have to think about how you get to the writing, and there's no developmental match all the way through. Let me say that after looking and analyzing what I saw as the flaws, I came to several conclusions, and this will include the math standards, even though I wasn't the mathematician looking at them. First of all, Common Core standards are not rigorous. Despite all the parrots flowing around and flying around saying they're rigorous, they are not rigorous. They were designed to allow the middle 40%, and this is what Milgram and I sort of worked out, the middle 40% of grade 11 students to enroll in credit-bearing courses in a non-selective college. That is the extent of where Common Core goes. It wasn't for all of our students, it was for just some of them. Secondly, it was very clear from my experience on the validation committee that Common Core standards are not internationally benchmarked. They couldn't possibly make our students competitive. And in math, it's very clear, as Professor Milgram says, if you don't have any standards for pre-calculus, and if you have very few standards for trigonometry, you are not preparing any of your high school students for STEM, S-T-E-M, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And he is one of the few people who is qualified to see that there are no pre-calculus standards and very few trig standards and a very weak Algebra 2 set of standards in Common Core. Who can tell you that or verify it? It would be your high school math teachers. They're the only ones. State boards of ed can't read a math standards document. That's one of the problems. I can't read a set of math standards because I'm not a mathematician. Only your high school math teachers could tell you if they were free to speak up. And that is a very serious, serious issue that I'll get to later on. So we have this problem of non-internationally benchmarked standards, and then there's no research to support Common Core stress on writing instead of reading and informational reading instead of literary reading. Nor is there research to support the value of cold reading of historical documents, which the chief architect of ELA standards, David Coleman, who is now president of the College Boards, has been promoting, as if you can understand the Gettysburg Address devoid of the context in which it was given. No historical speech or document can ever be understood without understanding purpose and audience, why was it given, where it was given, or whatever. This is his idea of how you level the playing field. Someone who never taught English from K to 12 and never taught English afterwards. Sue Pimentel falls in the same category. So we end up with a document that has no research at all to support its major divisions, organizations, philosophy, and it does exactly the opposite of what the research actually suggests. So that was the rational basis for my consistent criticism for 4 years of this document. I'll say just a few words about the validation committee before going on with some suggestions I have, because I'm always the eternal optimist, thinking that there may be enough rational people somewhere in this country to think about how you get out of this huge mess that has been created by a few people behind the scenes. Validation committee operated for the most part in secrecy. Deliberately, we were asked to sign confidentiality agreements at the first meeting. We could never discuss what happened in that committee. Now, I've been very active as an adult in my home community. Library board, town meeting, many selectmen committees. Everything was always open, sunshine laws applied, and anybody could attend any meeting and report on it. These meetings were totally secret, so you end up with a report of the validation committee's activities that has nothing in it, except here was the initial member list, and here are those who signed off on it, and nothing in between because everything was secret, was under a confidentiality agreement. So how could you have a reporter tell you about what happened? Because there was no way they could get a hold of the documents or publish them. But we also were given the criteria by which we would sign off in May of 2010 before the final version was released, which then tells you something right then and there. You see, there were changes being made behind the scenes to every draft of this document. But we were asked to sign off before the final document. We were considered rubber stamps. So Professor Milgram and I and 3 others were the only members of the committee that simply refused to sign off on these standards for the very reasons I've given you, plus the fact that we didn't even see what the final version was going to be, and in math, they were very different, according to Professor Milgram, from the public comment draft, so-called, that came out in March for 2 weeks that no one in the country even knew about. This was the validation committee, so I've talked about an invalid validation committee. There were only 2 content experts on this entire committee of 25 to 29 members. Professor Milgram was the only mathematician. Now, a mathematician is not a mathematics educator. A mathematician, I have to explain to many state legislatures, is someone who actually is in a mathematics department and they teach the math courses at higher education level. Mathematics educators are in a school of education typically. They do not teach mathematics courses. That's the basic difference. So if you want to know the content for science, engineering, and mathematics of a set of college readiness standards in mathematics, you do not ask people who don't teach the subject. You ask the people who teach the subject, and they are called mathematicians. This has been a revelation to me. Most people don't know who they are. They think that the people in the ed school who call themselves mathematics educators are mathematicians, are experts. They're not. They deal with pedagogy. Okay, I have a minute to get to some ideas. First of all, you will have to think about the way in which I approach the whole situation in Massachusetts. You need to restructure and reform your ed schools. If you want to deal with your problems in education today in this country, we've got to undo 50 years of damage. And we've got to raise the academic bar for entry to your education schools and change licensure tests. That's what I was doing, as well as doing K-12 standards. Secondly, you need to get first-class standards from somewhere. It means getting rid of what you have or adopting new ones on top of Common Core. In English, they're mainly skills, so you could add content standards to those skills. There's nothing that forbids you from adding another set of ELA standards to the existing ones. Nothing in the agreement that I know of that says you can't add and then make sure that you're going to require. Okay, I have to stop, but I'm going to take 1 more minute before I stop. Third, you need to have matriculation tests developed for higher ed. The major link, the major problem conceptually, and that was designed intentionally by Common Core, was to link K-12 to higher ed by means of something called a college readiness standard. Now, all of you know that most state standards have been for the high school diploma. They bypass the high school diploma. You can go from grade 11, if you're declared college ready, you go right to a credit-bearing course at the college level. And so you suddenly have a state board of education that is now in control of freshman courses at the college level. And what is happening is that they are being moved down about 2 grades to accommodate that setting of a college readiness level that is going to be somewhere around grade 8, 7 or 8. So to preserve the integrity of higher ed, they need to develop in each state their own matriculation test in math, particularly, as well as in English or reading. And we'll stop there because those are doable, but that will break the link between college readiness and higher ed, which was the ultimate goal of Common Core. That was where Common Core was going all along. That's why it was called College Readiness Standards. You have to look at the name. No other set of standards that we've ever had in this country are called college readiness because it was never seen as something you had to go to. Not everybody has to go to college. There are alternate high schools that should be available for different kinds of student interests. And in Massachusetts, we also had that network. But that was where you want to develop the broader vision of what you have as options for all of your students, curb the dropout situation, and preserve the integrity of higher ed so that you actually have engineers and scientific research and all the rest that this state, particularly now, needs. Otherwise, you won't even have them coming from this state. Maybe they'll come from China for a while. They'll go back.